Karen Whitman believed her role as HOA president gave her power, and she loved wielding it. Every morning, coffee in hand, she took her self-proclaimed inspection walk, patrolling the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff. She measured grass heights, checked for unapproved paint colors, and once even fined a teenager for leaving his skateboard on his porch. But her biggest target was the Johnson family. The Johnsons weren't bad neighbors, just different. They didn't obsess over landscaping, their kids played in the yard without perfectly matching outfits, and worst of all, they didn't seem to care about Karen's constant nitpicking. To her, that was rebellion. That morning, Karen's sharp eyes locked onto a brown cardboard box sitting on the Johnsons' porch. It was large, about the size of a microwave, and sealed with layers of heavy-duty tape. Suspicious. Packages were common in their neighborhood, but something about this one didn't sit right with Karen. The Johnsons had recently hosted what she called one of those loud barbecue parties, and she was certain they were breaking HOA rules again. Maybe this time with some unapproved project or illegal home upgrade. Curiosity burned inside her. As she paced the sidewalk, she spotted Mr. Johnson leaving in his pickup truck. Moments later, Mrs. Johnson ushered their youngest child into the car and drove off as well. Their house was empty. The package still sat there, practically begging Karen to investigate. Glancing down the street to make sure no one was watching, Karen strutted up the Johnsons' driveway. She tried to convince herself this was justified. After all, as HOA president, she had a duty to protect the neighborhood from suspicious behavior. Her fingers tightened around the box. Heavy. Whatever was inside shifted slightly. Karen frowned. Electronics? Tools? Something illegal? Without hesitation, she snatched the box and hurried back to her house. Her pulse quickened with excitement. Finally, she had proof of the Johnsons' misbehavior. In her kitchen, Karen set the box on her marble countertop. She grabbed a pair of scissors and began slicing through the tape. The layers were thick, almost as if whoever packed it really didn't want it opened. The last strip of tape peeled away, and Karen's heart thudded with anticipation. She flipped the lid open. A pair of black, beady eyes stared up at her. Before she could react, a creature launched itself from the box. Ah! Karen shrieked, stumbling backward. The skunk hit the floor, its tiny paws scrabbling on the tile. Then came the spray, a sharp, overpowering stench that struck like a slap to the face. Karen gagged, her eyes watering as she flailed blindly. "Out, get out!" she coughed, flapping her hands like that would somehow erase the stench. The skunk, panicked and disoriented, bolted through her kitchen, knocking over her expensive fruit bowl. Karen lunged for a broom, but her eyes burned too badly to see. The creature vanished into her hallway. By the time she stumbled to her front door and flung it open, her neighbors were already gathering outside. The unmistakable odor had drifted down the street. Karen stood in the doorway, hair disheveled, shirt stained, and eyes red from tears. From across the street, Mr. Johnson had returned and was now laughing openly. "Looks like you found Pepper," he called, grinning. "We were taking her to a rescue later today. Guess she got delivered early." Karen's stomach twisted. The worst part wasn't the smell. It was knowing the entire neighborhood was about to hear about this. Karen's house reeked. The stench clung to everything. The walls, the furniture, even the air itself. No matter how wide she opened the windows or how fiercely her air freshener sprayed, the foul, eye-watering odor persisted. Her eyes still burned from her encounter with the skunk, and her once pristine kitchen now looked like a war zone. Fruit lay splattered across the tile floor, and her favorite ceramic bowl lay in jagged pieces near the pantry door. Wearing rubber gloves, Karen shuffled back into the kitchen with a bucket of vinegar and baking soda, a cleaning tip she'd found online in her frantic search for solutions. The moment she knelt to scrub, the stench seemed to thicken, creeping into her throat. She gagged again, pressing a damp cloth to her nose. "This is impossible," she muttered. The worst part wasn't even the smell. It was the humiliation. She knew the neighbors had seen everything. The Johnsons were probably telling the whole street about her little mishap right now. Karen imagined them laughing, spinning some exaggerated tale about the crazy HOA lady who stole a skunk. Determined to regain some dignity, Karen marched down the hall to track down the skunk. It couldn't have gotten far. She followed the faint trail of overturned picture frames and scuff marks along the wall until she found her guest bedroom door cracked open. Peeking inside, Karen spotted the little black and white menace curled up in the corner beside her decorative pillows. Its fur bristled, and Karen froze. The skunk's tiny head lifted and its beady eyes locked onto her. "Nice skunk! Nice skunk!" she whispered. Armed with nothing but a laundry basket, Karen moved slowly, attempting to trap the animal without provoking another stink-filled disaster. She tiptoed closer, heart-hammering. Closer! Closer! The skunk twitched. Karen panicked. She lunged, slamming the basket down. Missed. The skunk bolted under the bed, and Karen heard the faint sound of tiny claws scraping against wood. She groaned in frustration. "Great," she muttered. "Just perfect." Moments later, the doorbell rang. Karen's stomach sank. The last thing she wanted was an audience, but she couldn't ignore it. When she opened the door, her heart sank even further. Mr. Johnson stood on her porch with a smug smile and a can of air freshener in his hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, far too cheerfully. Karen snatched the can without a word, but Mr. Johnson wasn't finished. "Look, I get it," he continued. "You're just trying to protect the neighborhood or whatever, but maybe next time don't steal my package." "It was suspicious," Karen shot back, stepping outside and shutting the door behind her. "How was I supposed to know you were harboring that thing?" "Pepper is a rescue," Johnson said, crossing his arms. "We're helping a sanctuary relocate her. If you hadn't stuck your nose where it didn't belong, she wouldn't have ended up in your house." Karen's face flushed, but before she could fire back, something thumped inside her house. The unmistakable sound of glass shattering followed. "Oh no," Karen groaned. "Sounds like Pepper's getting comfortable," Johnson said with a grin. "Good luck with that." He turned and walked back across the street, leaving Karen fuming on her own porch, clutching the can of air freshener like a weapon. Behind her, the skunk's stench drifted through the open window, a sharp reminder of her mistake. By the next morning, Karen's house still stank. She had scrubbed carpets, mopped floors, and sprayed every air freshener she could find, yet the foul odor lingered like a curse. Worse still, the skunk was still inside, hiding somewhere in the house. Exhausted and furious, Karen stood in her living room, clutching her phone. "I'm calling animal control," she muttered. Before she could dial, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. She groaned. Another neighbor, no doubt ready to gawk at her misfortune. To her surprise, it was Mrs. Johnson, standing with her arms crossed and a small pet carrier at her feet. "We came to help," Mrs. Johnson said firmly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Behind her, Mr. Johnson appeared, holding a pair of thick gloves and a can of sardines. Karen blinked. "What are you?" "Pepper's still in here," Mrs. Johnson interrupted. "We know how to calm her down. She trusts us." "I was going to call animal control," Karen snapped. "That'll just scare her more," Mr. Johnson said. "This is faster and less messy." Karen bit back a sharp reply. As much as she hated the idea of relying on the Johnsons for anything, she was desperate. "Fine," she muttered. "But if this goes wrong, it's your fault." The Johnsons moved swiftly, spreading a trail of sardines from the hallway to the open pet carrier. The sharp, fishy smell layered oddly over the lingering skunk stench, and Karen gagged. Moments later, a faint shuffling noise came from her guest room. Pepper appeared in the doorway, her tiny black and white face twitching as she sniffed the air. "Easy now," Mrs. Johnson whispered. "Come on, Pepper. Good girl." To Karen's amazement, the skunk slowly followed the trail of sardines, moving closer to the open carrier. Karen barely breathed. Just a few more steps. Suddenly, a loud bang erupted from the kitchen. A gust of wind had slammed the back door shut. Startled, Pepper spun around, her tail flicking upward. "No!" Karen shrieked, but it was too late. The room filled with an even stronger wave of that foul, eye-watering stench. Karen staggered back, coughing so hard her vision blurred. Mrs. Johnson grimaced but stayed calm, nudging the pet carrier closer. Somehow, miraculously, Pepper crept inside. Mr. Johnson slammed the door shut and locked it with a firm click. "Got her!" he cheered, holding the carrier up like a trophy. Karen could barely respond. Her throat burned, her eyes watered, and her house reeked worse than before. "We'll take her to the sanctuary right away," Mrs. Johnson promised. "Sorry about all this." "Sorry," Karen wheezed. "You should be apologizing for." "That's the thing," Mrs. Johnson cut in. We tried to tell you yesterday. The package was clearly marked as live animal, do not open. If you hadn't stolen it. Karen's face burned red. I was protecting the neighborhood. Sure, Mr. Johnson chuckled. Let's go, Pepper. As they left, Karen slammed the door behind them. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood, her pride stinging worse than her sinuses. Moments later, her phone buzzed. A text from one of the HOA board members appeared on the screen. We need to talk. Urgent. Karen's stomach twisted. Something told her the Johnsons weren't finished with her just yet. Karen sat at her kitchen table, still red-eyed and exhausted. The air in her house remained tainted with a pungent skunk odor, despite her relentless cleaning efforts. The text from the HOA board kept flashing in her mind. We need to talk. Urgent. She couldn't imagine what else could possibly go wrong. The emergency HOA meeting was held that evening at the community clubhouse. Karen arrived early, determined to defend herself. She sat stiffly at the table, arms crossed, watching the board members filter in. The Johnsons arrived last, sitting near the back with smug expressions that made Karen's skin crawl. All right, let's get started, said Greg Monroe, the HOA treasurer. He adjusted his glasses and glanced uneasily at Karen. There's been some concerning information brought to our attention. Karen stiffened. If this is about that ridiculous skunk, it's about a pattern of behavior, Greg interrupted. Several residents have reported suspicious incidents over the past few months. Suspicious, Karen scoffed. I've been protecting the neighborhood. Greg exchanged a glance with Mrs. Johnson, who stood and held up her phone. I think we should show the footage, she said. Footage? Karen repeated, her pulse quickening. Mrs. Johnson tapped her phone screen, and a video began playing on the clubhouse's large TV. Karen's heart dropped. The footage showed her sneaking across driveways, checking mailboxes, and even peeking through windows. Wait, I can explain, Karen stammered. I was investigating violations. The video shifted to something worse. Karen placing a warning notice on the Petersons' garage, one they hadn't deserved. Another clip showed her tampering with Mrs. Ellis's potted plants, intentionally damaging them to justify a violation fee. That's not. And this, Mrs. Johnson interrupted, is from a hidden camera on our porch. The video cut to Karen snatching the box with Pepper inside and scurrying away like a burglar. The room filled with murmurs. I was trying to protect us, Karen insisted. I was making sure people followed the rules. That's not all, Greg said. He flipped through some papers. We also audited the HOA funds, and we found a series of questionable expenses. What? Karen's voice faltered. Greg tapped his paper. Almost $2,000 in inspection equipment expenses charged to the HOA account. Turns out you bought surveillance cameras and installed them without the board's approval. They were for security, Karen protested. You put one in Mrs. Patel's garden, Greg said flatly, and another in the Johnsons' driveway. Karen swallowed hard. And let's not forget, Greg added with a hard stare, the fines. Half the citations you've issued were based on things you set up yourself to make people look like they were breaking rules. Karen felt her face flush hot. That's ridiculous. It's all here, Greg said, dropping a folder of documents on the table. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward. The truth is, you didn't want to protect this neighborhood. You wanted to control it. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but she saw the faces around the room. Disgusted, disappointed, angry. There was no point. What happens now? She muttered. We're voting to remove you as HOA president, Greg said, effective immediately. Karen stared at the table. I was just trying to. Her voice trailed off. You're lucky we're not pressing charges, Greg added coldly. The vote was unanimous. Karen barely heard the words as Greg officially announced her removal. She felt numb as she left the clubhouse, ignoring the whispers behind her. When she reached her house, she stood in her driveway, staring at her windows. The faint skunk odor still clung to the air, as if Pepper had left a curse behind. Suddenly, a car pulled up beside her. Mr. Johnson rolled down the window. Hey, he called. For what it's worth, we're not bad neighbors. Karen didn't answer. Maybe, he added, if you'd just talked to people instead of spying on them, you wouldn't have ended up like this. Before Karen could respond, he drove away. That night, Karen sat alone in her silent, foul-smelling house. Her spotless floors and perfectly trimmed hedges didn't feel quite so important anymore. For the first time in years, She wondered if her idea of control had been nothing more than fear. Fear of change, fear of not being the one in charge. And as she sprayed yet another round of air freshener into the stale air, Karen realized the hardest smell to erase was the stink of her own mistakes.